Geeks and geekettes, nerds and nerdorellas, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, comic book fans the world over, welcome to another thrill-packed, information-crammed episode of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me, a comic book writer of world renown, world fame, loved everywhere I go, stopped on street corners and asked for my autograph and selfies all the time. Happens every day, folks. You got to believe me. No joke. Anyway, you get to ask me questions about what I do for a living. What I do for a living is I write comic books. Let's not waste another second of your precious time. Eyes on the road. Snag this off of the Facebook. He's talking about the Conan book. Christopher Brown is. Glad I got mine. Are there plans for more? I answered I wrote a third one. They'll all be published in new editions by Titan. Christopher Brown says, excellent to hear. I need to talk to you one day about how you structure the style of a story. Been reading Conan since the 80s. Heck, I learned to read with comics. I would kill to write a Conan story. So basically your question is, how do you write a Conan story specifically, rather than generally how to structure a story? How to write a Robert E. Howard type Conan story, not just any old Conan story, but trying to stay in the flavor of Robert E. Howard, is basically how I write every story. Howard was a big influence on me. What Howard would do is open on some kind of action or suspense set piece in which he would introduce you to Conan. Now remember, Howard wrote these stories in Weird Tales magazine. And, they weren't written as novels. They weren't written as books. And so he's mixed in with a bunch of other short stories and novellas in Weird Tales. And, he wants his stories to work. He wants to gain an audience. But he realizes that, everybody's not reading every issue. Maybe they read a Conan story and then 6 months later they're reading another one and they forgot they read the other one. So each time he's got to reintroduce Conan at the beginning of each story, both to new readers and other readers who might have forgotten about him or kind of remembered him, but didn't remember any details. So each story begins with an action or suspense set piece in which he introduces Conan to us once again. And then we move into the conflicts, whatever characters he's going to meet, be it Belit or Valeria, or, introduce the villain, introduce the main MacGuffin. Each Conan story generally has some sort of a supernatural threat that Conan must overcome through might and main, and sometimes brains. Conan's not a dummy, but his first instinct is to fight his way out of a situation that he's just fought his way into. So the Howard formula is not really a formula because he plays a lot with it. I mean, Red Nails is different than Jewels of Gualar. Queen of the Black Coast is very different from Hour of the Dragon. So, but he, like most writers of genre fiction, has an ideal of what this genre story should be. If you're a whodunit mystery writer, your the ideal story you want to write is one that confounds and engages and then in the end surprises the reader. With Howard, I think it's just creating a story that moves briskly and builds its testosterone level until there's this incredibly violent conflict at the end that Conan must overcome. And Conan always has hard choices to make, and he makes them because he's a tough guy. But I think Howard's thing was, a man to be a man, testosterone fueled stories of conflict and warfare, and, guys doing stuff and women loving them for it, and, all that stuff, ultimate male fantasy stuff. And so every Howard story, whether it's Conan or Breckenridge Elkins or King Kull, probably not Solomon Kane, or his many boxing stories. He wrote a lot of boxing stories. All lead in this direction. The man's man, the ideal man, the ultimate pinnacle of masculinity. Tough, bold, whatever. And that's where his stories would go. So that's how you write a Conan story. You just introduce Conan and just crank it up. Just crank up the threats, and Conan is always up to a challenge, and he comes out victorious at the end. That's not really a formula. I don't know what you would call that. Is that a trope? Is that a type? I don't know what it is, but that's what Howard did. And when I wrote these Conan stories, that's what I did. By the way, I did finish the third one in this group, The Pit of the Blind God. I finished it like a year and a half ago. But Titan is going to be publishing all three in either 3 separate editions or 1 combined edition. I don't know. I really haven't talked to Titan about this. I just know they have plans and they will publish the 3rd book. Fear not. All right. David Wolf, have comic book writers and artists ever been paid on straight commission by established publishers? The idea being that quality creators would bet on themselves for a percentage of the profit. Is that a bad idea? I see it as not much different than the current trend of self-publishing, but with the added security of utilizing established universes. I'm not real clear on what you meant with the added security of utilizing established universes. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, you're talking about doing a project on commission, like I want to do this Batman book, and we're going to split the profits. It's never going to happen. Never going. DC and Marvel are not going to allow that kind of deal because they want to keep most of the money. Now DC, they'll pay you a royalty, and Marvel will pay you an incentive if they feel like it, and they can find a pen to write the check. But they're never going to offer you, that kind of deal. That's just never going to happen. Now, in the independent world, this stuff happens all the time. My earliest experience with this was back during the black and white glut of the 80s. For you youngsters out there, black and white comics became like a big thing. Believe it or not, it sounds strange, doesn't it? It's kind of weird. But they became huge because of the Ninja Turtles. And everybody was doing black and white comics. And it became like a fad. And I got in the tail end of the black and white glut because Eclipse was basically offering, look, if you bring us a property, because black and white was so cheap to print, you bring us a property and we'll print it. You have to pay the artists and the writers and everything else, and you bring it to us, and we'll publish it, and we'll split the profits right down the middle. And okay. So I came up with this thing, Radio Boy, and it was a satire on manga, and I only did 1 issue, and Dean liked it, so I got to go ahead, and I actually hired myself. I wrote all the stories. I wrote and penciled the first one. These aren't my pencils or inks. I wrote and penciled the first one, and then I wrote the 3 backups. And Flint Henry, Jim Engel, Tim Truman, Tom Wimbish, worked on all the backup stories, and a good time was had by all. And I sent the artwork in. I didn't pay anyone up front. I said, I'm going to pay you out of the royalties, and then, hit my knees at night before going to bed, praying that there would be royalties. I could pay everybody. But, it was friends, so they trusted me. And lo and behold, I got the biggest check I had gotten up to that point in my life. That little black and white comic netted me $14,000. So I paid everybody, a good page rate, paid everybody off. 14 grand. Now, why I didn't do a second issue, I have no idea, except I was so busy with Airboy and Conan and everything else, and I just didn't get around to it. And it was kind of a 1-joke comic anyway, so I didn't do any more. And the black and white glut ended. So yeah, Eclipse was really open to that. I think Black Belt Hamsters was done that way. Any number of Eclipse's black and white comics were done that way, and then they would just split the profits. And because I trusted Dean, I didn't have a problem with that. I mean, he was going to give me accurate reportage on the sales. I got a full, accounting of how much Radio Boy sales. Absolutely astonished me that this thing sold in the tens of thousands of copies. And it's largely forgotten today. But yeah, it can be done. And then in the crowdfunding arena, this is how this works. I mean, I'm currently working on a project with Compass Comics. I'm going to bring it to Compass Comics, and Graham's going to publish it, and he and Julie are going to fulfill it, and we're going to split 50-50, after Graham's covered his expenses. And I'm paying my art team and letterers and everything up front. I'm not paying myself anything. So I'm bringing that project, and that's working the way that you described. Ripascend, the Rippaverse's creator-owned line, where I have a project with them, and hopefully we'll have a second project for them very soon, which, again, I am packaging, I am bringing it to them, and I've paid all the bills, and then they publish it, and we split down the middle. So this is something that happens. It's never, ever going to happen at the major publishers. First of all, they don't want to open their books to you, which they would have to do in a deal like that. And secondly, why would they do it? They want to keep all the money. And also, I think there would be some copyright problems there. I mean, if you did like a Superman story where you did it for the back end money, you could conceivably later claim that you own that story because you weren't paid work for hire for it. You partnered with DC to do it. I mean, do this stuff all the time in the film world, but comics, it's the major league, not major league, they're not major league anymore. The boutique comic book publishers who publish, Batman and Spider-Man, they're never going to agree to something like that. Twin spin! Who let the dogs out? Okay. David Wolf again. I've railed for probably 25 years about making comics more accessible. Well, I've railed for 40. My collecting started with Batman Year 3, Issue 2, which I found at a random 7-Eleven while on a youth group trip. I collected the rest of the story at my local comic shop, which I previously never knew existed. But it was the convenience store that first brought me in. Well, you are the freaking poster child of everything I ever say about this stuff. The spin rack, the 7-Eleven, the grocery store, the drugstore that was your first hit of comics. That was your first exposure to comics for so many of us. Now it might be the Scholastic Book Fair at your school, or you may discover manga at Barnes & Noble. Get the hint here, folks. Get the hint here, publishers. Manga's selling huge. Manga's eating everybody's lunch here in the United States. Why? Because it's readily accessible. Got to make these things readily accessible to children. I know most of the people listen to me are adult fans. I'm an adult fan, big fanboy, love comics, love them dearly, dedicated my whole working career to comic books. But they're for kids, primarily for kids. And yes, there are adult comics, but you move on to them later in life. But to keep comics alive, to keep major public, I'm not saying comics are dead. Comics are vibrant now. Crowdfunding, manga, book trade, comics are vibrant. Now, outside of Marvel and DC, comics are happening, people. Seriously, take a look at the publishing figures on comics. They're fantastic. Marvel and DC are just lagging behind because they just don't get it. I'll go into that more in a bit. But you can't keep the medium alive unless you expose kids to it first. Adults are not going to suddenly say, hey, I think I'm going to read a comic book. No, it's kids. It's the bright colors, the crazy characters, the nutty situations, the vibrant imagery. I mean, comics are an attractive package. Comics are an immediate experience, as philosopher Robert Warshaw said about comics. They are an immediate experience, and kids gravitate toward that. And forget about, the competition from video games and everything. No, that's bull. That's an excuse. Weaklings use that as an excuse. Comics are cool no matter what, and they can easily compete with any other medium if you get them in front of the kids' faces. And that's what you've got to do. I mean, I was a young punk. There were no comic book shops back in my day. I went to news agencies, drugstores, newsstands. I used to have them on the corner in Philly, and I became like a regular figure. I mean, there was a newsstand at 45th and Walnut that used to hold the Marvel comics for me. They'd hold one of each Marvel comic so that when I went by, I was a little kid, my grandmother would take me by and the newsman would go, look, I saved these for your grandson. and then I would pick out which Marvels I wanted, because Marvels were really hard to find back then. So anyway, long story short, yeah, you're right. And then look what you did. You found them at a 7-Eleven, and then to fill out that series, because you got so interested in comics all of a sudden, you had to go to the comic shop. But you would have never gone to the comic shop cold. You would never even have looked for a comic shop. I bet you had to look for one to find out how to get the rest of the books. Or maybe somebody told you, hey, you can fill out the series that, your local comic shop, this place down at the strip mall, they might have the rest of these issues. And you went in and, oh my God, look at all these comic books. But you would never have gone in there cold. So there you go. This is a new one. Guest editorial. David Wolf was not satisfied with just asking questions. He had to make a statement, and I think it's worthy of all of us to hear. So these are David Wolf's words. I also can't stand hearing older collectors who state mainstream comics should be made for them because they have the disposable income. This reasoning is circular and cannibalistic. All ages stories and accessibility seem like such obvious pillars of success to me. You touched on it before, but I'm hoping you can go into more depth as to why the industry seems so intent on shunning new readers and committing suicide in the process. Well, comic book publishers, once upon a time, comic book publishers were run by, guys who thought all the readers were idiots, and it was just a business. But to stay in business, they had to listen to what the readers wanted. They watched sales figures closely. They did what is called redundant publishing. If crime was selling, they did more crime comics. When that sort of weaned away and horror looked like it was coming up more, they printed more horror. Western, war, whatever the kids wanted, they did. I mean, that's why in the mid-50s, there's a long period where there's no superhero comics except Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Because that cycle had ended. And then it begins again. DC sort of gets it going again with the new Flash and the new Green Lantern, blah, blah, blah. But these were guys who, I suppose some of them gave a rip about comics, but largely they didn't. They were just publishers. They were in the business. Frank Zappa used to tell a story about how the music industry changed. When it was the cigar chomping older guys who didn't know what these dumb kids wanted, and they would just make any kind of record. They would hear a new act and go, I don't know, it sounds like crap to me, but maybe the kids will like it. And they just throw it out there. And those guys were running the record companies, and the record companies boomed. The enormous business. And then they thought, well, the conservation of risk guys show up and say, well, maybe if we got a young person in here to advise us. So they bring in some hippie to tell them what the kids like. And of course, the hippie has no freaking idea what the kids like. He only knows what he likes. And Zappa said we were better off with the cigar chomping guys who weren't interested than the, some young dilettante trying to run the recording industry. Same thing goes for comics. When guys like Mort Weisinger and see, Stan Lee stuck with it, but guys like Mort Weisinger and guys like that left the business and left it to fanboys, the result was disastrous. In the 70s, comics just fell apart. Comics collapsed. Now, a more recent example of this, of not listening to your audience, I've described this in a recent video, Spider-Girl. Early 2000s, Tom DeFalco, Ron Friends were doing a regular monthly called Spider-Girl. Marvel was collecting it into trades because collecting everything in the trades became a religion to the comic book companies in the early 2000s. Well, lo and behold, Spider-Girl takes off. And it takes off with an unexpected audience because it was like a medium okay seller in the comic shops. Now all of a sudden, it's selling 70,000 copies in trade paperback. Do you know how much money that is? Get out your calculator. Like a $14.99 trade paperback that sells for $70,000. We're talking about real money. So this thing was hugely profitable for Marvel. But here's the difference. What was different about it being in the bookstore from it being in the comic shop? Well, in the bookstore, tweeny girls found it. Spider-Girl, cool, Spider-Girl. Here's a girl who's like Spider-Man. And they read them. They bought them. They bought them religiously. I mean, the trade paperback series went on and on and on. And the booksellers were smart enough to take this damn series out of the graphic novel section and stick it in the girl, like young adult section. They stuck it in with the Nancy Drews and the whoever else. I don't know anything about what girls read. Okay. They stuck them where girls would see them instead of burying them in the graphic novel section. And I remember going in Barnes & Noble and Borders, and you go to the graphic novel section, and they'd have one Dark Knight Returns and two Watchmen, and one of this, one of this, one of this. And then you go over to the girls section, and they've got Spider-Girl, 10 copies of each. And that means they were selling. That means they were moving. They were keeping them out on the shelf because they were going. Now here's the craziest thing. Marvel hated it. The editorial, intelligentsia, I use that term sarcastically, at Marvel didn't like this audience. They weren't interested in this audience. They weren't seeing dollar signs like the old school comic book editors and publishers did. They thought it was embarrassing. This comic was embarrassing because, first of all, it was Tom DeFalco and Ron Friends doing great work, meat and potatoes superhero stuff. They weren't being edgy. They weren't trying to be cool. They were just telling really interesting stories with an engaging, appealing character, and just doing good comics. They weren't trying to, do whatever. And Marvel just didn't like it. They're kind of embarrassed by it. So eventually they kill the series, because they're so embarrassed. Same thing over at DC, killing things left and right. Literally saying we're not interested in the Harry Potter audience. We're not interested in the young adult readership, which is exploding now, but we don't want them. We just want to appeal to our longtime fans, our longtime adult fans who are outgrowing or aging out of this hobby or dying. It's like, wow, that's a hell of a demographic. Everyone else is chasing 18 to 24. You're chasing 35 to 70. Makes no freaking sense whatsoever. And then, of course, we move on, and a new crop of nitwits come in to run the companies, and their ideal audience isn't even the old comic book fan. They don't even want them. It's like, oh, these dirty, smelly guys who go to cons and don't change their T-shirts. We don't want them anymore. We want this new audience. So we're going to do a bunch of, liberal agenda, leftist agenda stuff with, gender and race and all this other stuff. And we're going to transform your beloved characters into something unrecognizable and unappealing because we want our core audience, which consists of hipsters who live south of 14th Street in Manhattan, we want them to buy our comics. And guess what? Hipsters who live south of 14th Street in Manhattan didn't buy their comics. And so sales collapsed, and they are where they are today. And the only time they see any kind of comic that gets its head above water is one that appeals to old-time fans because they've driven most of their old-time fans away. So yeah, I mean, that's what's going on. That's why we are where we are. This is why the characters that you and I love are in the doldrums. They are dead in the water. Dan Perrin. As I know you're a huge Western fan, what are your feelings on Jonah Hex? Did you ever pitch? If you did, what was the plan? Who would you have wanted to draw it? Yeah, I was a Hex fan from the very beginning. I bought his first appearance as an all-star Western. I realized it was kind of like a spaghetti Western riff. Early stories are written by John Albano. The series was taken over by Michael Fleischer. And I think I read Jonah Hex to the very, very end. I read all of it. In fact, I was just to give you my fanboy street creds, I was rebagging my Westerns the other day, and I was rebagging my container of DC Westerns, which goes all the way back to the 50s, and I was rebagging all my Jonah Hexes, and brought back a lot of memories, and I thought, hey, instead of bagging and boarding these things, maybe I should read them again. But yeah, big Jonah Hex fan. Did I ever pitch? No, I never ever pitched. And the simple reason was I was really busy. I think the editor of Jonah Hex at the time was not friendly to me, was not open to pitches from me. And I had enough work. I was only going where I was wanted. And then they they had brought back Jonah Hex and put a heavy supernatural angle on it, and that interested me not at all. Not at all. You know, eventually, Jimmy Palmiotti would bring it back with Jordy Bernay doing a lot of the art. But, you know, and it was Jimmy's thing, so there was no room to pitch there. You know, he was taking up all the oxygen on Jonah Hex, and understandably, I wouldn't want, you know, anybody trying to crowd me out on something I was enjoying writing. Were I to pitch, it's pretty simple. Russ Heath would be my first choice. Russ Heath did I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's like, you know, I'm not going to spoil it for you. He did a Jonah Hex story in I think 100-page special, and it's one of the most memorable Hex stories ever, with a really shocking ending, which I will not reveal here. If you can find it, it's just a hell of a story. And Heath just knocks it out of the park. Heath was a terrific Western artist. And of course, my second choice would have been John Severin. He could have been my first choice, but Heath was more suited to the darker angle of Jonah Hex. I don't think Severin was a Jonah Hex fan. I can't remember Severin ever drawing Jonah Hex. Now I'm going to get 100 things saying, he did a miniseries in 2003. Okay, I don't know. I don't remember. But Jonah Hex wasn't the kind of character Severin was attracted to. Sort of darker, meaner, shoot him in the back kind of guy. He's more of a John Wayne guy than a Clint Eastwood guy, to put it simply. My other choice would have been Eduardo Barreto. Eduardo draws a hell of a Western. And I just always liked working with him. Even when I was on Batman, I would try to work in Western themes into the stories we did. You know, I would come up with Western themed stories. I did a Robin annual with him that was a Western. It was a modern day Western with, DC characters, Western characters from the 50s brought up to modern day. Yeah, he would be my other choice. Now, if I was to do Jonah Hex today, I would go with one of the Italians who do text. And Pasquale Frazenda would probably be number one, because I've sort of, through Facebook, become friends with Pasquale. We go back and forth about different stuff. And if you've never seen his work, he did work on Magic Wind for Benelli, and he also did the awesome text epic called Patagonia. And I'd probably go with a guy like that. And as you can see, if you're watching this rather than listening, this guy's artwork is jaw-dropping. And he's got a real feel for Westerns. But that's probably never going to happen. Jonah Hex is going to have to ride on without me by his side. Jason Manning. I just finished Levon's Prey. I enjoyed it, like all of the Cade books. But I think that him sparing a certain enemy was out of character. I assume you had him do that for a sequel hook, but I wonder if there's an in-universe reason. If you address it in Levon's range, I'll have to wait a month for my next Audible credit to find out. Yes, it is addressed in the next two books of the series. Yeah, in Levon's Prey, I introduce a character. I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't read it, but I introduce a character that normally Levon would shoot right in the head, but he doesn't. Now, why doesn't he? And when I got to that scene, I had every intention of Levon killing him, because he'd done a lot of rotten things. I didn't have him kill him. Partly because Levon had already killed a whole bunch of guys and was kind of getting tired of killing. It's reached a point where there's really no reason to shoot this guy. And I discussed this with another writer of some renown who read it and said, I think I understand why you did what you did, because it is kind of surprising in the book. This thing that happens is kind of surprising. Because, you know, I do a lot to make you not like this character, but I also did a lot for some reason to make him very, very interesting. And not sympathetic in any way. Kind of happens in the next two books. We get a little bit of sympathy. We can relate. We can understand this guy a little better. But this other writer of some renown, it was Vox Day, said that he thinks that I spared him because this character really hadn't broken Levon's code. And I thought, yeah, okay, well, I guess in my mind, subconsciously, that's how I justified it. I justified him sparing him because this character was being used. He had no idea the true nature of the people that he was working for. And Levon realizes this. This guy's a tool, and he doesn't need to die. If I let him live, he's not going to, he's come to Jesus now. If I let him live, he understands what he did wrong and the people he associated with, the true nature of the people he associated with, and he will walk with the angels now. Not quite, not quite. This character is troubled. Now Levon's range, I explore him a bit more. In the final book of the series, Levon's Scourge, and I remember when I sent Levon's Prey to Hutch, Michael Hutchison, my fabulous nitpicking proofreader. When I said it to him, he said, "Oh my God, I'm so glad you spared that character because I found him so engaging, so interesting. Why would you throw him away?" And so everybody was on the same page. Everyone who I listened to on this stuff was on the same page. So I hope I've explained to you. I mean, I didn't just do it to provide a sequel or leave an opening or just as a function of moving story forward. It wasn't a contrivance. It took a lot of thought on my part, and apparently more thought than I was aware of, which I'm often not aware of my own thoughts. The little voices in me were saying, "Don't kill this character. He's too cool. Cool in a dark way. I don't want to make any excuses for this character. He's a reprobate." And like they say at the beginning of every Blu-ray, does not affect my opinions. The comments here do not affect my opinions. Twin spin. Jason is back with, and if I can get a twin spin, already done. It's in the bag. It's in the mail. Would you have any ideas about helping a group of young children come up with their own comics? I know you're not big on how-to stuff, but I'm coming up with activities for a homeschool co-op, and I'm curious about even stray thoughts from a professional. Well, they'll be stray. They'll be very stray. Yeah, I mean, teaching kids to write comics, I don't like doing how-to. I don't like to tell anybody how to do anything. But there's a million ways to do comics. Kids like comics. All you have to do is guide them and sort of like articulate what a comic book is. A comic book is a series of still pictures that tell a story. And I used to speak at schools about doing comics, and I would draw on the whiteboard or blackboard a 3-panel sequence, and then sometimes I would hand out to the kids a 3-panel sequence, that I had Xerox with empty word balloons, and say, what would you have this character saying? How would you connect these 3 pictures using dialogue? How do you explain what's going on here? And I would show on the blackboard or whiteboard, sequential storytelling, and explain what comics are. And kids are quick; they'll get it. The other thing is they need to read a lot of comics. They need to read them. Now, not read them, of course, read them for entertainment. But you tell the kids, you just bring them a whole bunch of comics, all different kinds of comics, because kids are going to be, you're obviously asking this because you're a comic book aficionado, so you have a bunch of comic books laying around. I used to bring comps when I went to speak to classes. I would just bring boxes of comps and just give them away so the kids could see comics. Many times, their very first exposure to comics. So anyway, have the kids read them, but tell the kids, look, while you're reading it, stay conscious, pay attention to what the artist and writer are doing here. Why is this panel like this? Why is that panel like this? What do they do here? The mechanics. Like, pay attention to, how a comic book page is laid out, panel composition, where the characters are, what's emphasized in the panel, all this stuff. Sort of like look at the comic with new eyes, and even better, reread a comic you already are very familiar with. If the kids read comics, and study it. And this is what I did as a kid. I studied. If you could stare a hole in a comic book, I would have stared a hole in Spider-Man Annual 2, because I studied that story. Just studied it. Kirby, a lot of Kirby. Even though when I was a kid, I wasn't that big on Kirby. I sort of learned to appreciate Kirby later on. Uh, but I realized Kirby was effective. You know, and so why did this scare me? Why did this make me laugh? Why did this fill me with dread? And I would just study that page. You know, how did he make me feel that way? And that's what that's the best thing. It's just immerse them, and then let them do comics any way they want to do them. You know, if they want to do a comic strip, they want to do a Sunday page, they want to do a comic page, they want to do a series of splashes and everything. It doesn't matter. Let them just do it whatever way they're going to do it. You know, don't do a lot of correcting because let them find their voice, to use a airy fairy term for what I'm trying to get at. And my first comic book character was Melvin Mudball. I used to draw him myself, and I was probably 5 or 6, and I created this character Melvin Mudball, and I would generally write stories or do cartoon drawings with word balloons to amuse the other kids in class. And Melvin Mudball could be anything. He could be an astronaut. He was a Nazi at one time. Kids. A superhero, a detective. He could be anything. And I generally created him because he was easy to draw. And Melvin Mudball was a funny name. At least we thought it was funny when we were 7. So, but that's where it starts. Little acorns. But yeah, just expose them to comics and just sort of. Or try to articulate the medium to them in terms that kids can understand. But show them, everything, every kind of comic. My youngest basically learned to read. What really clicked with him was Mutts, the comic strip Mutts, because a lot of times, oh God, what was the guy's name? Whatever the creator's name was, he would have silent panels. So my son learned the language of comics by looking at Mutts. And then as they got to the more verbose comic strips, he was really curious about what they were saying. And that drove him to want to learn how to read because he was kind of a problem reader. We homeschooled. And my wife had the hardest time teaching him how to read until we got the comics and we got the tactile. So I'll go into it another time. Tactile was a really, really important part of teaching him to read. And I think it should be an important part of teaching everyone to read. But we'll go into those woods some other time. David Jordan. He asks, is Larry Yakata a pen name for Larry Hama? Larry Yakata is a writer in Savage Sword of Conan, and upon looking him up, I can't find anything but a list of Savage Sword of Conan issues he wrote, so figured it's a pen name. Okay, well, I'm going to dispel this rumor right now. Larry Hama and Larry Yakata are 2 entirely different people. And I saw them together in a room a few times. So I saw them both at the same time. Further proof that Larry Hama and Larry Yakata are 2 different people is Gary Quapis was working on a Larry Yakata script and realized that there was something in the script that was going to raise hackles at Marvel. We probably have every religious group after us. And, there will probably be the PTAs burning the comic in front of junior high schools. And he brought this to Larry's attention. Gary called Larry Hama and said, there's something in this story you might want to change. You might want to talk to the author. He's going a little far here. And Larry was like, well, let me look at the script again. Because apparently Larry had just skimmed the script. I believe Larry Yakata was a friend of Larry Hama's. That's why you only see him in Savage Sword of Conan. He didn't have a comic book writing career beyond Larry Hama's office. And so Larry called the other Larry and read him the riot act, since you can't have that stuff in a Marvel comic. And then Gary just sort of changed the scene in question to make it more palatable. So there you go. Dispelling that urban myth right here. Because if Larry Hama was going to write a Conan story, this is written under his own name. So he wasn't double dipping on the writing, editing thing. Jason Shepard, would you rather instantly master one language of your choice or one musical instrument of your choice? I've never been attracted to music, and I don't have a musician's personality, although my wife tells me I do. My wife says there's no difference between a writer's personality and a musician's personality. And I beg to differ, kinda. Yeah, there are similarities because it's both creative and both like living in your head a lot. But I've never sat at a party going, you want to read my story? I'm going to read my story to you. Uh, so musical instrument out, and it would be cool, but look, with a musical instrument, you're like, oh, I would like to instantly know how to play guitar. Well, even if I did, even if I was given a God-given talent to play guitar, I'm never going to play like Prince. I'm never going to play like Eric Clapton. So what's the point? Foreign language, on the other hand, cool. I'd like to wake up tomorrow and instantly be fluent in French. That'd be kind of cool. I mean, more practical would be Spanish, but I don't really run into that many situations. And probably more practical Korean, because I have so many Korean friends, and some of them, their English isn't that good. They're they're recent immigrants. I mean, recent, last 30 years. But I like to learn French. French would be cool. Because I don't get it. I mean, I like a lot of French movies and TV shows and stuff like that. And it seems so different from English, even though so many of our words have their roots in French. Anyway, that's, that's that. That's that's the question. Hey, what you reading? I'm kind of folding the old what you reading videos into the Ask Chuck Dixon videos because I get tired of making two separate videos. Even though I get more views by two of them, who cares? I'm not monetizing these anyway. So you're going to have to listen to what I'm reading unless you decide to move on to listen or watch another video somewhere. I heard Nerdrotic's on the air. I heard Nerdrotic's always on the air. I think Nerdrotic is on the air even when he's asleep. They just train a camera on him while he's sleeping, and he gets 1 million views. I love you, man. Speaking of kids, engaging kids in comics, I discovered, this is from Paper Cuts, a series of these little digest-sized hardcovers. Really cool and really cute. And they're little history lessons in comics. And they're apparently created by Louis Trondheim, who's a European comic book genius. And they're little digest, little hardcover books. And it's about a brother and sister, and they're generally at play. And the sister makes some sort of reference to some historical event, gladiators, trench warfare, the plague, slavery, Albert Einstein, whatever. There's a whole series of these. And she, the little brother is real curious. He says, well, what's that? What do you mean? And then she begins to explain. And the two characters actually wander through these historical settings. I mean, the trench warfare one, they're actually wandering through the trenches of World War I. And narrowly getting blown up and stuff like that. It's not really an adventure thing, but it's let me move that over. You can see the big sister. It's not really an adventure thing. It's just to add a little humor or suspense or whatever, to try to give the reader a feel of what was going on through these characters. But they're pretty detailed, and they're very fair, and they reveal a lot of information because they're from Europe and they're not America centric. Most of the information is Europe-centric, but I'm fine with that because they're not representing critical race theory or gender studies or anything like that. They're telling a pretty straight up, accurate portrayal and with a lot of imagery. Apparently, a lot of research went into these things because the imagery is terrific, and then there's further information in the back. But they're fun, short little reads. I can imagine an 8 to 11-year-old reading these easily in one sitting, and gleaning a lot of information without it seeming like information overload comes through in these things. And of course, the art is charming, and they're just really cool books. I've read 2 or 3 of them. I'm probably going to pick up the rest because I really did enjoy them. And I like books like that. I have shelves of children's picture books about Vikings and dinosaurs and all that stuff. Because first of all, they're great for visual reference for the artists I work with, and secondly, I just like them. They're always an attractive package. The Dorling Kindersley books and things like that make for just kind of a cool thing to pull down every once in a while, just leaf through. like we used to do when we visited the library. But I'd highly recommend these to anybody who has kids. Pick a couple of these up, and they're relatively cheap. I got them on Amazon for like $6.99. They're probably available even cheaper somewhere else, but they're from Paper Cuts, and they do a lot of comics for kids in very attractive packages. And there you go. There's your tip for the week. One to grow on. Hey, if you want to get in contact with me with more of the kind of excellent, probing, thought-provoking questions we had today, and I mean that in all sincerity, contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com. brunobookstore@gmail.com is the most reliable way to reach me. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thanks for liking, subscribing, and all the other wonderful things you do. And especially thank you for all the fantastic questions. And I will see all of you, I hope,